Everyone, Liam here. Welcome to this week's YouTube video. This week we're going to be going over how to paint a Black Templar Space Marine with no airbrush as always. So if you've got any questions, queries, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll absolutely get back to you. If you want to support the channel, it means a huge amount to me. Feel free to check out the Patreon where you get additional, more in-depth video content. And also I'm available for one-to-one tuition if you do want to improve your painting. Thank you very much for everyone's support. Here we go. So first thing that we need to do is start sketching out our volumes where we want our highlights. I want to point out, I forgot that the shoulder pads on Black Templars needed to be white. So when I start putting highlights on those shoulder pads, just ignore that. It's only the trim that we need to do. So the first color that I'm using is Vallejo model color Black Gray. The model has been primed with a black primer. I think it was a Vallejo primer. I can't exactly remember, but any black primer will do. Preferably a black that you like. So what I'm doing is I'm highlighting every area depending on the shape. So for example, the legs are cylinders, the knee plates are spheres. So we're highlighting it according to the shape that they are. Now, this is the initial color. So we're going to go a lot brighter than this. I'm also not too bothered about how smooth I'm being with it because ultimately we're going to have to smooth out a lot of stuff anyway. So it's a much stronger option for me to make sure that my highlights are all in place very early on, and then I can smooth them all out later, because that way at the very least, if something doesn't look right, I'm going to know that very early on before I've spent absolutely ages blending it all together. The important thing to remember is we want to make sure that we keep a lot of the black on this model. So in those dark areas, we want to make sure that we keep loads of black. We want to keep our highlights very small, almost so we're going for like a shiny effect, because without the black, it's obviously not going to look black. The larger our highlights, the more gray it's going to look. Even if you've got black in the shadow areas, it's still going to end up looking gray if you've got very large gray highlights. So just something to think about. You want quite small highlight areas. Now, I'm working up to, this is a Vallejo model color dark blue gray. So the difference here is it's an off grey, so it's got a little bit of blue into it. This adds some interest. Now, the main thing is with the highlight areas in this case, we're going to go smaller. So we're going to work within the highlight areas that we did previously with the Vallejo model color Black Grey. This is where it's going to start looking really rough because we're not worrying about the transitions just yet. What we want to know very early on is, are we going to have a black looking Space Marine or are we going to have a grey looking Space Marine? There's no point spending ages blending all this together and then finding out that your volumes are not really right and it looks very grey. It's also worth noting, like, I'm not one to work with very thin paint. This paint is probably thinned down to maybe 2 parts water to 1 part paint. Ideally, I'm looking for paint that's opaque, that is as opaque as possible, just because it speeds things up. We can always work with thinner paint later on when we start smoothing it together. Can't stress this enough. You don't always need really thin paint. It's more important for you to understand why you've got thin paint, and then what will happen is you can adjust your paint consistency depending on what you're trying to achieve. And you can see on screen at the moment that we've got our highlights in place really rough, so we need to start smoothing these out is going to be the next step. But I think what I want to do with these is towards the head, I want to brighten up the highlights around the head and the shoulders, and that will make the top part of the model more prominent. So I've added a little bit of white to that to that Vallejo model color dark blue gray, just on the peaks of the shoulder pads, just on the top of the head and the collar. I'm putting very small highlights. Now, if these are looking too bright for you, then don't worry about it. Remember, it's always better to push your contrast in value, or your contrast in light and dark too much, and then you can tone it down. Whereas if you don't push it enough, then it's just going to look flat and you're not going to know. You're not really going to know. So it's better to push it too far and you know that you've made the right choice and tone it back down, rather than not push it enough and it looks very flat and uninteresting. And that's what we want to try and avoid. So you can see how the brightest area of this Marine at the moment is the top of the body. It's also worth noting I'm probably going to need to push the highlight on the knee and that top of the thigh as well, because that is going to receive quite a lot of light. So what we need to start doing now, we've got highlights in place. I know at this point that I like what I'm seeing. I like how bright that we've got, but what's going to happen now is we need to start blending all this together. There's multiple ways that you can do this, but the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get that mid-tone grey. So at the moment I'm working with the Vallejo model colour dark blue grey, and I thin that down quite a lot. So this is the point where we've gone to like 2-3 parts water to 1 part paint. The idea here is we're looking for something transparent, and I'm blending those transition points between the greys that I've got and the black area, and I'm blending them together. Now I'm jumping between different paints here. So I'm jumping between the Vallejo model colour dark blue grey, and I'm also jumping between a mix of the Vallejo model colour black grey and the Vallejo model colour dark blue grey. So basically what I've done is I've got those two colours, and then I've mixed them up 50-50 as well for something in between. And I'm jumping between all of these colours. I'm thinning them down so they're transparent. That's what's important here, is they just need to be transparent. So when we work over those colours that we've already got, that's going to smooth out the result. Now it's up to you how you choose to do this. There's several techniques that you can use. You can glaze it together, which is much slower, and you'll probably get a nice smooth result. You can layer it, you could wet blend it if you want to. Me personally, I quite like to use stippling and variations of, which is why when you see me painting, majority of the time I'm actually using the tip of my brush and I'm doing lots of really small marks. There's several ways that you can do it. Whatever works for you is absolutely fine. There's no correct way, it's just the process that you enjoy the most. I wouldn't say stippling is the fastest way of doing it, but because that's the process that I enjoy, it's definitely quicker than most ways for me myself. So finding your own personal way of painting is really important. It's not just about mastering all techniques, it's about finding your own process and then mastering the techniques that you like to work with. What I would suggest is you focus on the areas that are really important. So if we're doing this as an army painting piece, which is exactly what we're going for here, what you need to remember is the majority of the model people are not going to be looking at. The majority of the model people are going to be looking at from above or from the front. So what that means is in this case, the head, the backpack and the shoulder pads and the top of the chest, those are across the army the most important part. And then in this case, on that particular model, the leg that's running forward, that knee and the thigh is very prominent. So what I would suggest, assuming that you don't mind spending loads of time on your models, to speed things up, focus on those areas when it comes to getting a better result. So if you have a nice smooth blend on the head, the shoulder pads and that leg and the chest plate, 99% of people are not really going to look at the rest of it. Now, obviously, if you're going for a army that you want to win best painted, then the truth is that you need to make the quality as good as possible all over. But that's not the point of this video. So in my case, when I'm painting armies, I want to be picking out the areas that are really going to make the most impact, and I'll spend the most time on those. And that's why if you look at the head's got this really nice shine spot on it, same as the shoulder pads, because ultimately that's what everyone's going to look at. And if we've got a squad of 10 of these, that's going to be the thing that's going to have the most impact. Now, what happens is as you blend this together with all the greys, what you're probably going to find is your highlight areas, the areas that you're blending together that are brighter, they're going to get wider and wider as you blend them together. So there is absolutely a stage where you need to go back with the black and blend the black over your highlight areas to make them smaller. Because remember, if you lose too much black, the model will just end up looking grey, and that's what we need to avoid at all costs. And you can see this is what I'm doing now. There's black on my brush at the moment. I'm glazing over those darker grey areas, and that's bringing back the darkness that we need. Now, I say this quite a lot in my videos. Colours on everything else on the model can change how the model looks. So before I go any further with this black armour, I'm going to paint the base coats in for the other colours. Now, the only things that I'm really focusing on this is the chest eagle and the shoulder pads. That's pretty much it. That's fine. So I'm using Vallejo game Colour IDF Blue. This is basically just a really pale blue grey, and I'm putting a base coat down to just get a coverage. This gives me a good idea of what we're trying to, how the colours are going to interact. And it's the same as, I'm going to do exactly the same with the bolter casing and the chainsword casing. I'm going to put a base layer down of Games Workshop Khorne Red, I think it is. And this gives us a good idea of what the black is actually going to look like. And the reason why I say that is because if you've got, let's say for example, the shoulder pads are really black and the chest eagle is really black, what happens is if the majority of the black in your paint scheme is in those areas, when you go to paint the white, all of that black's going to disappear and potentially your black armor is going to start looking grey because your darkest colors are no longer there. So this is why it's really important to get to a fair stage on your model and then make sure that you've got base colors down on everything else. This gives you a true reflection or a better reflection of what this is going to look like in the end. Kind of decided that I didn't like this knee pad black, so I was going to paint that white as well, just to break up all of the black armor because it is a little bit boring. Black is not the most exciting color, although it looks quite nice. It's not, very rarely like pops unless you want to spend a ridiculous amount of time on it. So with the white on, made me realize that I wanted to push the shine spot on the head. So I made that little shine spot brighter. And then that's basically makes it pop a lot more. With the power weapon, with the chainsword, what I'm going to do is I've put down the Khorne Red as a base color. And then I'm going to do a very fast wet blend from black to Khorne Red. And then that will just give me a very quick transition. So it doesn't look so flat. And then I'll add in the edge highlights. And that will work for them. You see, like I said earlier, I'm pushing the highlight on the leg. So I'm making that bright spot on the leg brighter so it makes it more of a prominent feature. This is just something that looks really nice, to be honest with you. It's entirely up to you if you do it or not. But if the light's coming from straight ahead, that leg is light outwards. It's going to receive more light than everywhere else. Now, with everything painted on, I realized that I did want to push the highlights as almost as bright as possible. So I've gone to almost like an off-white when it comes to the shine spot on the shoulder pads and the head. The reason for this is, remember, the brighter our highlights, the darker our shadows look. So as long as we have lots of black on the model, black is going to look darker because we have such strong highlights. The other thing to know is I have not been careful when I'm painting this. I haven't worried about painting into the little recesses or anything like that. So I need to go back and fix those. So we need to go back and redefine any of the recesses or the little recess lines. You can do this with a wash if you want. I personally just used black paint, which I was using, which was Vallejo Model Color Black. This defines everything. And then the last step, which is really important for black armor actually, is your edge highlights. I know not everyone is a fan of edge highlighting, but with black armor, it's incredibly important because the shadow areas with black normally just look unpainted if there's nothing there. And if you put like lots of gray to highlight an entire shape, then you start losing the actual look that is black. It just starts looking gray. So edge highlights are really important when it comes to black because they give readability to areas of the model that are not necessarily even painted. They've just got one color on them, and readability is incredibly important because remember, you want to be able to see these models from far away. You want to give your brain the easiest task of understanding what they're looking at as soon as they look at the models. So edge highlighting is really important. You don't need to edge highlight every single edge. What I would say is edge highlight the edges that are facing upwards, or more importantly, any edges that are going to actually help read the shape of the model in any one area. And remember, you don't need to do massively bright edge highlights. Not everything needs to be like Tron style. What you can do if you want is just have a very subtle edge highlight, so only a little bit brighter than the color that it's surrounded by. So that makes it far more subtle. So you can do edge highlights without it being like luminous bright. I know Games Workshop in the past has done that quite a lot, and to be honest, it's a nice result, but that's a choice in style. If you don't like that, then just use a darker paint. You only need the edge highlights to define your shapes, remember. It's a tool to use. So next up, we need to paint the white. Now, white is notoriously a nightmare of a color. So firstly, I would recommend that you get a decent white. Yes, some whites are better than others. In this case, I'm using Vallejo Model Color White because it's quite opaque. so it gives me quite good coverage. Now the first thing that I'm doing is the shoulder pads, the top half of the shoulder pads, I'm getting a solid base coat of white. I'm not worried about the transition to blue. First of all, by painting the white over the IDF blue, this will give us a nicer, easier time actually trying to get that nice flat white base color. And by going over that blue, actually what happens is when we try to blend the white into the blue, we can use the blue to actually smooth out the transition, because the blue is a much stronger color. By already having that blue there, it makes life a lot easier. So Vallejo model color IDF blue, sorry, Vallejo game color IDF blue is the base coat for the white. And then I'm going over it with Vallejo model color white in the areas that I want to have brighter. So I've got a solid base coat. And then what I'm going to do is once all of that's dry, I'm going to smooth it out by using the IDF blue. That will, the blue basically behaves much better than the white. Generally speaking, when you're using white, you end up with a much chalkier result. So for me anyway, I find it's easier to base color with the white and then smooth it back out with another color. Now the chest eagle is really nice and simple. It's straightforward, not necessarily easy to do, but the chest eagle is exactly the same. Base coated the eagle with the Vallejo IDF white, and then each individual feather I'm just going over with a solid coat of Vallejo model color white. It's not easy to do because it's quite a small area, but it gives a nice result. This is a tabletop piece, remember? So I painted this in about 3 hours on stream, so there was a lot of talking and messing around in between. I could probably get this down to about an hour on model. So most people potentially would be able to get it down to about an hour and a half to 2 hours, I would imagine. Especially when it comes to batch painting lots of them. So it is a relatively fast process if you don't have an airbrush. I mean, if I'm completely honest with you, the black armour, I wouldn't paint with an airbrush personally. I much prefer painting black armour with a paintbrush. But the white shoulder pads, if you got an airbrush, I would absolutely recommend doing it with an airbrush, because it is a lot easier, it is a lot faster. White is one of those few colours which just, if you can airbrush it, always airbrush it, because it's just a nightmare. Now, as it stands right now, the black armour is done. I'm quite happy with that. The white we need to start smoothing out. Now, I don't really want to go straight to the IDF blue. So what I've done is I've mixed up a mix between a 50-50 mix of the white and the IDF blue. And then I've thinned it down to maybe 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. I'm very gradually smoothing these two areas together. What I would say to you is try to avoid the brightest white areas. You don't want to go over the white that you've already done, because all that's going to happen is that's going to make the white darker, and then you're going to have to brighten it up all over again. The idea with this is you're kind of blending together with the mid-tone with very transparent paint. This is probably the part that will take the longest, because you do need to be a little bit patient with it. And I mean, the result that you get is entirely up to you. I haven't gone particularly smooth with this. It looks good from a tabletop perspective, but if you wanted a higher end result, you would basically just spend a lot more time doing it. Basically, the more time you invest into getting that nice smooth transition, the better it's going to become. So with the weapons, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on them. I paint on a coat of black on one half, Khorne Red on the other half, and then while that paint is still wet on the model, I blend it together, and that's how I get my gradient, and that's interesting enough for what I need. Now, what I would say from an army painting perspective, generally speaking, the things that people look at is going to be the head and anything that they're holding, like the weapons. So weapons are actually one of those things that I would recommend, if you have the time, to spend quite a lot of time on in comparison to everything else on the model. Again, this was a speed paint, so I wanted to do something very simple and straightforward. And you can see how it just goes from dark to light on the casings of the weapon. And then what I'm going to do is add a very quick edge highlight. And what this is going to do is it just frames the shape of the chainsword and the bolters, and that'll be good enough. It will look nice enough. Now with the eyes, I wanted to do the eyes blue, so the base color that I did over the black was Vallejo model color dark Prussian blue. And then with a Vallejo model color Andrea Blue, I painted towards the inside of the lens, so the lens that goes towards the nose. The idea being is we're going for a transition from dark to light on the lens, and then in the dark area we're going to put like a little white dot to simulate a shine. Now the theory behind it is very easy. Actually doing it can be quite challenging. I appreciate not everyone's got the brush control to do it, but what you're actually hoping to do is just push your outer areas of the lens towards the outside of the head to as dark as possible, preferably black. That way when you put the white dot in, it really pops. And then towards the inside of the lens, towards the nose, that's where you want to be going to like an off-white. So in this case, I added a little bit of white to the Andrea Blue, and that gives us the shine. That gives us the brighter area on the inside. And then you can see the difference that the white dot makes on both sides. Now, I did blue. Personally, like in hindsight, I probably would have done green, to be honest with you, because there's already, like, we've already got hints of blue in this paint job all over. So those blue lenses they're not very prominent. They're not very striking. So personally, I would have done green because they would have stood out a lot more. You can see with these weapons now, I'm just adding in those edge highlights. This is what's going to give us the shape. Now, again, like I said they're not anything over the top. If I was going to be doing, if I had the time to invest, I'd spend a lot more time painting the weapons, because let's be honest, it's something that stands out when you look, when your opponent and when you are going to be looking across your table at these models. Then the last step is just to paint in the metal areas. So in this case, I've used the Vallejo metal color steel. It's a really good paint, flows really well, which means you can paint really easily. And then what I'm going to do is just put a wash over the top. So what you can see with this model is I've spent the majority of my time painting this model on the actual armor and on the white shoulder pads, because those are the areas that people are really going to look at. Nothing else really needs to be that crazy. So obviously the more time you spend on it, the better it's going to look, and naturally the better your army's going to look. But the truth of it is if you have the main areas looking half decent, then the model will look great. I mean, the whole bottom half of this model is not even painted. I haven't painted the underside of the legs or anything like that. Those are just pure black, and frankly you wouldn't even notice unless you pick this model up. So this is the sort of thing where you could either leave it like this if you struggle for time when it comes to painting, or you can take this to the next level and really smooth everything out and put in some really nice bounce reflections. It's a very good starting point for if you're looking to get a much better result. And that's it. As always, I hope this has been helpful. Any questions, queries, leave them in the comments below. Thank you everyone for the support. It means a huge amount. And if you've got any requests, anything that you want to see, feel free to let me know and I'll make some videos for it. And I'll catch you all later.